Hi everyone, and welcome to Jasmine's podcast. This week I'm going to be talking about trauma healing, and conflict resolution. So before we start, I just want to give any listeners a warning because I will be talking about a personal recent trauma that I went through, and it might be a little personal and a possible trigger for some people. So please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. I will also be talking about mindfulness techniques and how it's actually helped me, so I hope it will help you, and stay tuned. So first off, what is trauma? According to an academic journal written by Catherine Dolmas and Caroline Hilarski, trauma encompasses 3 phases. Number 1, environmental input. Number 2, perception and immediate appraisal of an event. Number 3, psychological reaction. Putting all these together, trauma is based on the level of a personal distress of an event or circumstance that is related to a person's perception of the event while factoring in the person's characteristics and the context. So it's all dependent on that person's perception and how they define the event. In my PACS 331 class in week 2, we also took a look at how trauma could look like a serious injury, a shock, violence, or an accident. It's usually unexpected or when you're least unprepared and you can't stop thinking about the event. Trauma can affect us physically, emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively, and spiritually. I'm going to share a story of how I perceived to have saved my friend Miriam's life. It was Sunday, November 25th, nighttime. I was in Starbucks all day writing a paper, and a group of my friends and I, including Miriam, all decided to meet me at Starbucks and walk across the street to grab food at Burrito Boys. This is when the accident started to happen. We were about 500 meters away from a major intersection and decided to jaywalk to Burrito Boys. For those that don't know what jaywalking is, it's when you don't cross a street at a crosswalk. We crossed halfway of the street and approached the median of the road. All of us stopped because we saw a white car in the left lane that was signaling to enter into the lane that we were standing on, and they stopped for us. The moment I decided to check whether the right lane was clear, I noticed the blue car coming out of nowhere, and it started speeding up. And at that second, I heard someone running, and it was Miriam. I told myself there's no way the car is going to hit her, and she's going to run across the street before the car passes by. But because the car was speeding up, it hit her, and the impact of that hit was something out of a movie. She hit the hood of the car and she flew up in the air a good meter above the car, flew back down, which broke the window, and she fell off the car and rolled on the pavement, and she ended up a good 2 meters in front of the car. I heard people crying, but my fight system kicked in, and somehow I ended up on the phone with 2 phones, and I was trying to call 911. Suddenly some lady came out of nowhere and started cradling Miriam and telling her that she's going to be fine. Miriam and then gained consciousness and started crying, and the first thing she said was, "Am I going to die? I don't want to die." And I tried to clear out of the way, and I tried to see if there was any blood coming out of anywhere. There wasn't any, but she tried to reach for her head, and I told her to hold still and not touch it, just in case if it would have created more damages to her fractures and broken bones at the time that I thought she would have. But her body was in a crooked position and there wasn't any blood, so it seemed like a really good sign. The driver came out of the car and his hands were shaking. He tried to approach Miriam asking, "Are you okay?" But everyone was just freaking out and tried to yell at him and say, "Back off." I can't even imagine how traumatized that driver must have experienced the whole thing. But at that moment, I was able to reach dispatch and I began to tell the operator what just happened. Seconds later, the cops showed up and somehow the ambulance was there too. But because I was the only person at the scene able to really describe what happened in detail, I wrote a statement, and then I noticed the ambulance took Miriam to the hospital. The cop told me and my friends that unfortunately we weren't crossing at the crosswalk. It was dark outside. Miriam was wearing dark clothing, and there was no way to tell the car was speeding up to intentionally hit her. The blame was kind of on us, and the cop recommended us drinking a peppermint tea, and the next thing I knew, I was back in Starbucks, and as if the past 15 to 30 minutes didn't even happen. So if you're wondering how Miriam is doing, she's on her way to healing, and lucky enough, she doesn't have any broken bones or fractures. She has some bruises and cuts on her legs and some blood clots on her head. But other than that, she doesn't really remember what happened to her the second that she got hit by the car, and is finding it hard to remember certain things. But in grand scheme of things, she was super lucky, and we're all grateful that she's doing perfectly fine now. So some would ask, how did trauma affect my memory in the brain? And this can be actually explained by Dr. Daniel Siegel's hand model. So if you were to hold your hand out and put your thumb in the middle of your hand and put the rest of your fingers on top of your thumb, your hand should create a fist. This is a great representation of the brain. The wrists acts as a representation of the spinal cord, and the brain system and the limbic system, which would include the amygdala, hippocampus, thalamus, and hypothalamus, is right along the thumb area. And all is which below the cortex. But the higher part of the brain, where your fingers are covering your thumb, this part actually allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And where the knuckle area of the hand is a model of what can be a similar representation of where our brain is located right in front of our forehead. This area helps to regulate the limbic and brain stem area. So when something triggers a certain emotion related to the trauma, that causes people to go back to that fight or flight response. The cortex can flip up where fingers are, and it causes people to lose flexibility to adapt to situations or lose morale reasoning. I want to end this podcast by talking about mindfulness. The authors Harrington and Dane state mindfulness practices can be used in clinical settings for pain relief, eating disorders and weight loss, stress reduction, performance anxiety, symptoms of depression, PTSD, and many more. To start off using mindfulness techniques is to first focus on our senses again. For example, I've been focusing on my body more by doing small stretches throughout the day. I would pull my head from side to side and make sure my neck gets a good stretch. I've also been focusing on the textures and tastes of food to bring mindfulness to my senses and tastes. This really allows me to really be in the moment and not really think about anything else. Above all, I've been using an app called Headspace. Headspace is a free app that provides both Android and Apple users with a variety of short voice recordings to bring mindfulness techniques and practices in our everyday lives. I believe this is a great tool for people that need reminders to have a moment for themselves or whatever they want to work on. I know that I've been using this very useful technique called noting. And basically, I would make mental notes of when I'm triggered or when my fight or flight response is kicking in. It's allowed me to stop for a second to think and use my morale reasoning. I've slowly stopped thinking about my trauma, but perhaps it's because I've witnessed my aunt pass away this past weekend, so I'm also dealing with a new set of trauma. But nonetheless, I highly encourage everyone to check out the app because they currently have over 1.5 million people using this app. I want to thank you for listening to my podcast. It took a lot of courage to share my story, but I'm happy that I got to. I want to leave with a quote by Buddha by saying, "Our sorrows and wounds are healed only when we touch them with compassion." Thank you for listening and have a great day.